All right, so today I'm going to be giving a workshop on music technology and production. So, so I guess all of you should know who I am. So I'm Isaac, and I'm a PhD student at UC San Diego. So to begin with, I'd like to start by really breaking down like what is the actual science of sound. So thinking about so what is sound? So sound is it's essentially a pressure wave, right? So in this diagram, um, you can see that there are individual basically air particles, and when a sound source acts upon the air, it'll create pressure waves that will locally condense um, the air particles, and then also it'll disperse air particles, and essentially what you see below the particle is like the actual waveform of the sound as it travels, and something that's important is like sound similar to light is a traveling waveform. In this case, it's a longitudinal waveform. So certain properties of sound is so sound the pressure wave, because it is a wave. Some functions of waves are like they have amplitudes, but in the context of sound, the amplitude of this acoustic pressure wave directly corresponds to the loudness of the sound, and of course that's measured in pascals, but typically people in music production will use decibels instead of pascals for pressure. So another property of sound is pitch, and pitch is a function of basically what the frequency of that pressure wave is, essentially the distance between the peaks. So so in basic physics, frequency is a function of the wavelength. It's the inverse of the wavelength. So some properties, these are just properties of waves, and so sound, similar to light, it has certain properties such as constructive interference and destructive interference. So what constructive interference is if you have two waves that are in phase with each other. Let's get my cursor over here, and you can see that these peaks are basically perfectly aligned with each other. So when you have two waveforms that are perfectly in phase with each other, and they'll add together to make a waveform that's larger than the two of them. And the inverse is true, where if you have two waves that are perfectly out of phase, essentially where the peaks and troughs of the waveforms align with each other, you can have destructive interference, which is where the two waveforms will sum and actually annihilate each other, leading to no sound at all. So this can actually have more complex results. Of course, normally your sound waves aren't all going to be the same exact frequency, they're not going to all be the same exact amplitude, and so pretty much everything we hear is some sort of complex addition of multiple frequency waves. But something that's really interesting is that when you have two basically waves that are very similar in frequency, but not the exact same, you can essentially get pulsating beats. This is due to that both constructive interference and destructive interference. So constructive interference, where the peaks are aligning with each other, and destructive interference when they're out of phase. And so in the context of something like orchestra, so imagine someone tuning at 440 hertz and the person next to them tuning at 441 hertz. It's like, to a normal person, they wouldn't be able to hear the difference. But actually, if you're to play them right next to each other, you'd actually be able to witness this pulsating beat waveform. So moving on, some more properties of sound is sound travels through a medium, which in this case is air, but of course it can reflect off of surfaces. But so when it encounters a surface, if the surface is perfectly flat, perfectly hard, it'll follow the angle of reflection, which is essentially the angle of incidence is equal to the reflected angle. So the how sound hits it will be exactly how it reflects off of it. But this is not the case when we hit irregular surfaces, and you get scattering. And so this scattering it will basically, you can have like all those other properties, constructive, destructive interference, and it'll change how it sounds. So so this pressure because so it's actually a physical property, right? The sound wave, it's actually air physically moving. A pressure physically moving through space, through air. So the sound actually it attenuates, basically meaning it loses energy as a radial function as at the farther away you go from a point source. So, and that function is 1/r squared. So so as you get farther and farther away from a sound source, it'll basically it'll decrease in energy and amplitude as 1/r squared. And the speed at which that it does that is dictated by the speed of sound. So the speed of sound, I'm just gonna move this over here real quick. The speed of sound is dictated by two material properties. So Ks, which is our bulk modulus of our medium, and the density. And so bulk modulus is simply if you were to try to compress air, so it's basically a measure of how the air compresses. In solids, solids are different because so of course air can move out of the way. In solids, the atoms are pretty much fixed in their positions, and so it's determined by something called the Young's modulus. But yeah, so because other mediums such as water and like a solid like steel are much stiffer, the speed of sound is actually faster in a medium such as water or in a ceramic or something like that than it is in air. But this is the speed of sound in air, and the speed of sound is not to be confused with anything like pitch, the frequency of the wave. So the wave will travel at the speed of sound regardless of the frequency, and then that's because it's a traveling wave. So now that we have some sort of basic understanding of what sound is and how it works, so we have to try to think about, okay, well, how do humans actually hear? So in this diagram, basically what I'm showing you is, we have a musician and an instrument. They're playing. That sound signals translate through the air. It hits the room. Then of course it'll interact with our listener. So so essentially what happens when that sound wave hits the ear? So basically like the outer ear just acts as simply as like a funnel to funnel that pressure wave into the inner ear, and then when you get to the middle ear, so sounds traveling through air, it'll hit this middle ear, and essentially you have tiny bones and these ossicles that are inside the middle ear. What they'll do is they'll take that sound wave and they'll actually amplify it and interact with the oval window of the tympanic membrane of the inner ear. And so what happens is when the air hits this, so it's going to amplify a signal and actually will hit this membrane. And now those vibrations are being transferred. The mechanical vibrations are being transferred from air into this fluid that's inside the inner ear. And so what this is actually the cochlea. And inside the cochlea, there's this membrane called the basal membrane. And I'll explain more of it later. So essentially, once that pressure wave has been transferred into the cochlear membrane, the frequency of vibration will cause the basilar membrane to vibrate at different locations. And so for very low frequency noises, the low frequency waves can actually travel farther than the high frequency waves. And so they'll go all the way to the end of the basilar membrane, versus high frequency noises will be basically cause vibrations really close to the oval window in the ear. And so here's a video that can kind of explain really quickly, what I was trying to explain earlier. We have our sound waves that are passing through the ear canal. So they get here, they reach the eardrum, and causing it to vibrate. So and then of course these ossicles are amplifying the noise, right, and transferring it from air to this fluid medium. So it causes the basilar membrane to vibrate, which in turn will stimulate electrical signals, which travel to your brain. So something that's really important to understand is really fundamental, but people have 2 ears, right? So it forms what people call a binaural system, and so this allows for space perception, and that's due to differences in the amplitude and phase of these sound waves. So if we look at this diagram on the left, so essentially we have a sound source interacting with a person, and so the left ear is actually physically closer to the sound source than the right ear. And not only that, but there's also this sound shadow caused by the person himself. So in going from the left ear to the right ear, this sound has to travel extra distance, right? So that extra distance can potentially cause what you see here, which is phase disparity, which means the signals are not in phase with each other anymore between left and right ear. In addition, because how I told you that the sound wave, the energy decreases as a function of 1/r² from the sound source to the other side. The loudness, of course, is lower on the right ear than the left ear, and so the combination of these two, the phase and loudness, enable us to have that space perception. One final fun fact is, humans actually do have a really impressive hearing range, and when you compare it to all these other animals. Specifically, we are a lot better than these other animals that hear in low frequencies. So we can hear in the almost to the sub bass frequencies, so 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. But of course, beyond 20 kilohertz, we physically cannot hear anything, and so all our hearing range is dictated basically entirely by how the basilar membrane, like the length of it, and how far those signals can travel into the inner ear. And so this is a function of our biology. So now I'm gonna pivot and start transitioning into trying to talk a little bit about music technology. So we understand now, a little bit about how sound works, and then a little bit about how humans interact with sound. So now the question begins of how is sound transferred to people, and in modern day it's through recorded music. So recorded music really began in the late 1800s with Thomas Edison, and so he basically invented what is a mechanical recording device, which takes those sound pressure waves and basically inscribe them onto a physical medium. And in this case is tinfoil. Other mediums from the early 1800s were like wax, for instance. And so, but essentially, as you can see on this figure on the right, there's this huge funnel, and all the musicians are all standing on the outside of the funnel. And the reason they're standing on the outside of this funnel is because literally this funnel is funneling those sound waves onto a surface where it can be directly transcribed. So it's the vibrations, the sound vibrations are causing like something like a stylus or something to move on this purely analog recording medium. So later, like in the early 20th century, there's this whole revolution in electric recording. And what this is essentially, instead of having sound being transferred from mechanical vibrations to a mechanical motion of a stylus or something like that for the recording, so that mechanical vibration is transferred into an electrical signal, and the electrical signal can be recorded. And so in this case, for a majority of the 20th century, audio signals were recorded to like vinyl, or specifically just the disc format. And so the electrical signal was etched into a physical disc, and then you could read that signal for playback. Starting, this is actually still, it actually as early as like the 1930s, but wasn't until much later we started getting into a magnetic recording medium. And essentially, with magnetic recording, we take those audio signals, and so previously we it was still very physical. So even though we were recording electrical signals, you're recording electrical signals physically by carving it into a medium. So with magnetic recording, we take those electrical signals, the same electrical signals, and instead of inscribing it into a physical medium, you take the signal, and that signal will basically control the magnetic field of a recording head. And in the case of a magnetic tape, when the tape is reeling, it's constantly being magnetized at certain intervals, and that magnetization is the representation of the electrical signal. So starting in the early 1970s and going really into modern day, we started getting into digital recording, which is what I'm going to talk exclusively about today. So digital recording is all about taking, so it actually, if you look on this image on the left, this is a digital recording medium, but notice it's still using tape, magnetic tape, like we were using, like I was discussing previously. The difference between, say, digital recording and, say, like those magnetic medium, is digital recording is all about, it's not about recording the analog physical signal. It's about converting it to a digital representation of basically discontinuous, discrete bits of information that can be processed by a computer. And so even though it is on a tape medium, what is being recorded is not the analog signal, but instead it's a binary set of information. And that's exactly what we utilize with compact audio discs. Is essentially we have these bumps that are all along the surface of the disc, and so laser scans around the surface and it looks for these bumps, but the presence or absence of a bump is a form of binary information encoding, a 0 or a 1. And so all you need is just very simply one bump or no bump. And so it's a much more robust way of recording information. So we really transition into today. So it's really, really brief. And today, all music production is done on something called the digital audio workstation. But of course, so we have this workstation, but well, like, how do you actually connect instruments and inputs, microphones, everything to it, and you connect it and using something called a digital audio interface, something that will take whatever instrument inputs and convert them into a digital signal for the computer to understand, right? So I guess, like, to really understand that, though, we gotta ask the question: how do microphones record sound? So what a microphone is it's a transducer. What a transducer is it converts energy from one form to another. All along I've been talking about how sound is a pressure wave, right? But it's a physical. It has energy. It has it's a pressure, so it's a force over an area. So when that pressure, it'll actually hit. This is an example of condenser microphone. It'll hit a diaphragm, and essentially will cause the diaphragm to vibrate. And displacement of the diaphragm can cause a lot of things to happen. Depending on the type of microphone, but in the end, essentially what happens is you get a electrical current that comes out, and so you've basically converted this physical pressure sound wave into an electrical current. So, but microphones are not all built alike. So I won't go into any depth at all about the different types of microphones, but there are properties that you should understand. So we kind of understand how microphones work, but we need to understand. So what the polar pattern represents is essentially looking out from, say this is the tip of the microphone. You'll see this is the location of the sound field that it can pick up. In this case, we have a cardioid pickup pattern, which means that the frequency, so it'll pick up this same pattern, the physical spatial pattern, at all frequencies, which is good. And this same microphone has actually essentially a flat response, which means that it will pick up almost all frequencies equally. So so this is really good for getting something like a clean recording. But remember, of course, I was mentioning that humans are binaural, and I'll come back to this point several times. But microphones, by their very nature, they're transducers, so they create just a single signal and a single electrical signal, and that single electrical signal, isn't, like, if you were to play it back, it wouldn't sound natural to us. We're used to hearing with both of our ears and hearing in stereo. So in order to capture something that sounds realistic, you always need two microphones. And here are just 3 examples of different types of patterns, just microphone recording techniques. It's not comprehensive, that you can utilize to achieve a stereo sound field. If you notice, this is that polar pattern. It's actually the same as this one in the previous image, and that's on purpose. I wanted to show how this pickup pattern is used in stereo recording techniques. However, there are other microphones with other polar patterns. So in this case, you have basically an omnidirectional microphone where it hears right in front, right in back, but nothing top and bottom. and one that has, oh, sorry, this is the omnidirectional right here, and this is like a ribbon microphone. So this one's a bidirectional microphone, and this one's omnidirectional microphone. But yeah, so when those signals are represented, like I was saying before, the mono sources, they represent sound in terms of a single linear signal, and microphones, by their fundamental nature, record mono signals. But you know, that's not what we want to hear. We want these two stereo sources. While recording, so you have essentially the strength of your audio signal. You know, we've converted that sound wave into an electrical signal, but of course there's a lot of say background ambient noise. You'll never have a perfectly noiseless room, and that's because I mean, like the air itself is actually moving, right? The air particles are moving, and that's due to just the temperature, right? The thermal nature. However, typically microphones will never record all the way down to that, and so they'll have their own ambient noise, maybe from the electronics inside of it. And so, but when you're recording, you always want your signal to be louder than the noise, right? That should be pretty obvious, because if your signal is below the noise, you just hear nothing, you just hear noise. So, but basically the ratio of how high that signal strength is to that noise is that signal to noise ratio. So one thing that's not reflected in this graph, though, is that there's actually, in digital recording, there's actually a threshold that your signal cannot cross. And so you can't keep increasing your signal to noise ratio to infinity. So you're limited. So moving along, so this is a little bit more information about those digital audio interfaces. So we take these audio signals. So an analog audio signal, this is just a pure, say like a voltage readout, a current readout, or something from our electrical source. And we'll take that waveform and we'll chop it up into these discrete intervals that are called samples. And the sampling rate determines, you know, exactly how closely the digital wave represents the analog wave, and that should be very obvious with these images. You can see with lower sampling rate, doesn't look like a waveform at all, versus a higher sampling rate. You know, it looks very similar to the original waveform. So, you know, typically in commercial audio recording, they'll record at 44.1 kilohertz. But the interfaces themselves are actually capable usually of recording much higher, up to 192 kilohertz. So the final information of just like basic music technology is this format called MIDI. So MIDI so stands for the Musical Instrument Digital Interface. So it's here it says it's a notation that enables human gestures to be encoded. Basically, if on this diagram you can see that there's someone pressing a key, and when someone on a keyboard, so when someone's pressing a key on that keyboard, what it's doing is it's recording information such as pitch. So that's obvious, right? You know, what key is it on the keyboard? You know, how fast somebody pressed it. So you can incorporate things like vibrato, stereo space or spatial effects, which is panning, and tempo information. And you know, MIDI is really powerful because it can trigger digital samples. So you can essentially sample any instrument, any sound. You can create your own samples and use this interface to trigger it at any tempo, any pitch, anything that you would like. And so it's a very, very, very powerful tool. And it's utilized extensively in modern music. So so I've given you I'm giving you a lot of background. You know, how does sound work? How do people hear? You know, what is the history of you know of sound recording, and you know what are the basics of how sound is recorded. So that's where we are right now. So I'm going to go back into talking about the digital audio interface, and talk about basically how we can apply it to music production. And so let's you know think about you know what is music production. You know, of course, music is different from sound. I've been talking about sound, but music is not sound. Music is basically giving structure, you know, to that sound. But in music production, right, you have you or I said or an artist. If you're working with somebody, somebody has a vision of what you want something to sound like, and music production is that method. This is how you get that idea into reality. Um, and by reality, I mean the recording medium. And so, of course, this should be obvious. You have to use your ears, right, to in audio production. So using your ears is your best tool for music production. But of course, being able to hear something, you also need to have the experience and understanding to know how to actually shape audio signals in the event that they don't represent what you have in your head. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, is how do we actually shape these audio signals. So before I get to that, so let's look at the very most important part of like a DAW, a digital audio workstation. And it's called the sequencer. And so what a sequencer enables us to do is essentially allows us, here I say allows us to align audio tracks temporally. So you can see we have many different audio tracks, and we can and here this is a timeline, and so we can place these audio tracks wherever we'd like in our timeline. But of course, with the more tracks that you add, you know, all these tracks have to be basically perfectly in sync, or else you will. So it'll also sound bad, but you'll encounter things like, say, like the phase issues just from the fundamental properties of sound waves. But modern DAWs have tools such as quantization, which can help us to align these poorly recorded tracks. But they only help to a certain point. So the key really, and this is with all aspects of, you know, photography, videography, audio recording, it's always best to have something good to start with. So having a properly recorded audio signal is much better, much easier to work with than having to manually try to quantize and align and everything else. It is possible, but the result is not as polished. So you have, you know, you have all these tracks, and each one of these tracks contains an audio signal. And so, but of course, those audio signals have to go somewhere, and they go into what's called the mixing bus. And this is just the main interface for how audio signals are routed throughout a mix, and it's pretty. It can become pretty extensive, and so I'm going to break it down a little bit later. And then this is not in every digital audio workstation, but it will be in, you know, most professional studios, right? Is for every single one, every single thing on this mixing bus, every single audio track. So you have the track itself, but then you also have the signal. But like of course it goes through like some sort of instrument, some sort of interface to get into that mixing bus. And so these are how the instruments, you connect them to the digital audio interface, which is on the instrument rack. That connects it to the mixing bus, and then you can manipulate the audio signals temporally in the sequencer. So, going back and let's break down what this mixing bus is and some of the tools available on it. The most fundamental tool is something that's called the fader. And so what the faders do is they enable us to vary the dynamics of the audio track during playback. So these little knobs control the gain, and then the gain can be adjusted at any point in time, and so these can be controlled over time for dynamic effects. Another basic tool is, we want to utilize that that stereo sound field, right? We can utilize it with tools called panning. And so what panning does is it enables us to place these audio signals within a field. So we can actually say, I want this audio signal to be all the way to the left. So it's pure, this is a hard pan, hard left. And so that signal is only coming through like the left audio channel versus, right, pure right audio channel. And there's tools such as width, which controls the width of the audio signal, basically how much overlap is there between the left and right channels. More signal processing tools. So, the very first thing before you do anything is you usually want to control what the gain of the signal is. So fundamentally, this is the gain is the volume, right? The volume of that audio signal. But right, we can use a fader for dynamic playback. So we can have the audio signal be at a certain volume, but then we can change that volume over time using something like a fader. Right, if your audio signal is not essentially in the shape that you want to hear, or say there's a lot of chaos going on. So one of the most important tools in the audio signal processing is equalizers and filters. So there's two types of filters: low pass filters, high pass filters. So low pass filters actually cut off high frequencies, and high pass filters cut off low frequencies. That's what these really sharp declines are. And the equalizer, this is a very, very dramatically equalized audio signal, and you can see how pretty much we've reshaped this entire signal to follow the shape of our equalizer, our EQ curve, and so those are controlled with these tools right here on the left hand side. And so that allows us to have really precise control over the frequencies in any individual given audio signal. We can control the dynamics, we can control the gain, but sometimes sometimes our audio signal on its own, when it's playing back, will become, say, very loud. And so there are these signal processing tools called compressors, which enable us to, once the pressure in terms of decibels of a sound source exceeds a threshold, the compressor will allow us to reduce the output, and the amount of pressure reduction or volume reduction of the output is directly proportional to something that's called compression ratio. And you can see here that there's different ratios. 1 to 1 means that nothing's happening. 2 to 1 means that the audio signal is reduced by a factor of 2. The slope here is 1/2 of the slope of this line, 4 to 1, 1/4. And infinite basically means that the audio signal, once it hits this threshold, it cannot go above that threshold. So that's an extreme case of compression. And so both upward and downward compression are possible. Here, I'm saying, if it crosses above a certain threshold, you're going to decrease the amplitude. It's the same is true if say you had a signal that went below a certain threshold, and you could increase the amplitude. So very similar to a compressor is something that's called a gate. And I guess the point that I missed in the compressors is that they restrict the dynamic range. So the dynamic range is the difference between your loudest audio source and your quietest audio source. And so with the dynamic range, when you restrict it, you're losing information, of course. So compressors would lower the volume when it crossed a certain threshold, or increase it when it went below a certain threshold. Gates do the exact opposite. So gates will lower the gain of an audio signal when they fall below a certain threshold. So if you look on this graph on the right, you have an input, and then when it's below the threshold, it takes the input and turns it to 0. When it crosses the threshold, it'll allow the audio signal to pass. When it goes below the threshold, it'll hit a 0 again, and so on and so forth. So the difference is that some gates utilize hysteresis, which will, when you're really fluctuating close to that threshold, it can be dramatic when you hear the signal just dropping out. And so it'll have some time information where if previously it was above the threshold, it'll stay open. So I think this is my final signal processing tool I'm going to talk about. So this is a limiter. So limiters are compressors, but the difference is that they dramatically restrict the dynamic range because their compression ratios are generally always greater than 10 to 1. But limiters are actually useful in terms of making sure that your digital audio signal never crosses something it's called the 0 decibel threshold. Essentially, I guess I'm not going to cover it in this lecture at all, but if I go back to one of these mixes, you can see here we get up to 0 decibels, and we get this little red marker. And basically what that's saying is that it has crossed a threshold where it cannot be played back. So digital audio, once it crosses 0 decibels, it will always have this infinite, infinite compression. And that's called clipping, and that's due to something that I'll talk about later. So I lied. So I do have one more category of signal processing. I'm not going to go into depth. So these other ones were all fundamental tools to music production, versus effects are very specific, and but it's a huge, massive category. These are all signal processing tools, just like the previous ones, except for they have different effects. In digital audio workstations, they're really powerful in terms of everything can be simulated. Because they're all electronic devices. We can model the circuits. And so we have amplifiers, phasers, reverbs, auto-tune, whatever you want. There's just so much that you can do. But I'm not going to explain how any of these work. So that was, as brief of an introduction to music production as I could possibly give. But of course, music production is not complete without mastering, um, which is the final stage in the music production process. Um, and so I guess, like, let's ask the question again of what is the goal of audio mastering? By the time you get to this stage, those musical ideas are already set. They're already set. However, you have to think, this audio track is going to be played back in different environments, different by different people in different places, and so really, the most common goal of audio mastering is to make sure that that audio track will have somewhat of a universal playback capability. And during the process of audio mastering, a lot of times we will increase the perceived loudness of the track, or of course, like, master specifically for whatever playback medium is going to be in. So, some examples of different audio playback devices are cell phones, laptop speakers, headphones, earbuds, PAs, movie cinemas, automotive stereos. But I actually do want you to consider these questions. First of all, are the playback devices capable of playing what you've produced? So I showed you earlier the frequency spectrum of a microphone, and I showed you how microphones, basically record sound. So speakers are also transducers, but they do the exact opposite of microphones. So microphones are all about taking that pressure signal and turning it into the sound pressure wave, and turning it into an electrical signal. So speakers do the exact opposite, where they take the electrical signal and turn it back into a sound pressure wave. And so microphones had different frequencies that they can pick up. Speakers have different frequencies that they can play back. So the playback really differs across these devices. And of course, are there specific contexts that this will be listened to? And that's most obvious in like something like a movie theater, right? So movie theaters are usually have greater than stereo sound. They'll have like 5.1 surround sound, which is completely different. And so you really have to optimize your master for that medium. So going back, I mentioned this earlier in the lecture of how music is represented digitally. And right, it's discretized. We take this analog audio signal and then convert it to a discrete representation, a discrete set of data points. However, there's a lot of problems that come with listening to like these discrete waveforms, and essentially one of the biggest things that can happen is that when you chop up this wave into discrete bits, you can get these are false harmonics. These are basically sounds that do not exist in the audio recording, that are present because of how it was chopped up in the discretization process. Mastering engineers will use dither along with other tools to shape this the spectrum that comes out. And so by introducing actually some noise, some background noise, we can reduce the amount of false harmonics that are caused during this process of truncating our analog wave. So yeah, you can see here's our original wave. There's this one peak as probably caused from the 16-bit reduction, and then when you reduce it, you get all these peaks, and then but of course after using the dither, we're able to reduce it. We're not able to eliminate it, we're able to reduce it. So when things are being played back, you have to understand something. There's two terms, bit depth and bit rate. So the bit depth, so fundamentally right here, it says the number of bits of information in audio sample. So it's essentially how much information can you preserve, and really, so with a higher bit depths, you're actually able to have higher dynamic ranges. You're able to record really loud and really quiet sounds. So in reality, what we hear in real life, so there is no limit. There is no limit to dynamic range. Like you can have sounds being, as loud as like say a planet exploding, which would be like enough pressure to annihilate you. There's pressure waves that are so powerful that they can instantly perforate your eardrums. But there's sounds so quiet, like I was talking about thermal noise, that just from the air molecules moving. But we're never going to be able to capture that. But the bit depth is really the main limiting factor of how much can we capture. Bit rate. So bit rate is a dependent variable of bit depth. So if you have a lower bit depth, your bit rate will automatically be lower. However, you can reduce the bit rate, the number of bits per second, and that's how people, when I go into audio compression, that's how they fit these audio signals into smaller file sizes. But of course, lower bit rates suffer from distortion, and that's because you're actually just literally eliminating audio information. So most music we receive is encoded in a lossy compressed digital audio file. So this compression is not dynamic range compression. Like I talked to you about what a compressor is in terms of a audio workstation, but this is not that. This is basically reducing the amount of information stored in the file. And so how we go about it is basically we'll take that audio signal, that digital audio signal, and then we'll, even though we have samples, we will sample it even farther and take those and pass them through several filters, something called the fast Fourier transform. Another filter is encode it and transfer it to something that the device can actually read. So the decoding process is the exact opposite. So you guys probably have heard, of course, of MP3 files and AAC files. So these are the most common lossy encoding formats. So MP3, MPEG Layer 3 was developed first, and AAC was developed later by Apple. But to give you an idea of how much information you lose in these lossy encoding formats, so here's uncompressed audio. If we recorded at 44.1 kilohertz at 16 bits, which is not the highest you can record it at, your bit rate will be this 1411 kilobits per second. So MP3s have a maximum bit rate of 320 kilobits per second. So no matter what, you're never even gonna get close to this original bit rate. So AAC files can be arbitrarily big, but say we were to increase the sampling rate from 44.1 kilohertz to 192 kilohertz, bit depth from 16 bits to 32 bit. We would have tens and tens of megabytes per second, hundreds of megabytes per second. Just, so we lose a lot of information. But all is not lost. We still listen to digital music every day. So audio tracks, cannot be directly uploaded, unfortunately, to popular music services such as Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, Amazon, Google Play, Deezer, all those. So music has to go through a verified third-party distributor such as a record label or an online distributor in order to get on these services. But one important thing is that I was telling you about these encoding formats because these different audio streaming platforms. So, all modern music pretty much is streamed nowadays. So all these streaming services encode their audio files in different formats, and they will adjust the bit rates for your internet bandwidth. And so what you hear throughout the entire mixing, mastering, recording process, a lot of times is not what you hear coming back. And trying to understand how and why it's different, it really comes down to understanding how like essentially like, you know, data compression like works on a fundamental level. So that's it for my lecture. If anybody's willing to stay afterwards, I have 2 examples that I can show of 2 different mixes. But yeah, I'd like to open up to questions.
Hey, Isaac.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks for that. Just a question. In your early slides, you mentioned how if you have 2 waves that have the same frequency but are 180 degrees out of phase, they like, cancel out perfectly, right?
Yes.
So I just been thinking, is that possible in real life? Like, I'm imagining 2 people like, playing A at 440 at the same time, but like having it perfectly canceled out. That would be pretty cool. Is
It's
there
yeah.
any way to achieve that?
I mean, you can achieve it. You can't achieve it usually with people playing, but you can achieve it with computers, right? It's it's almost impossible to get it like perfectly out of phase. So you know, probably what people hear in real life is something in between the constructive and destructive interference. But usually it's on the constructive interference, and that's a function of more where people are placed in space rather than like say instrument tuning.
And I think it also has to do with like the timbre of the instruments. Like I think on another slide you had like how like 2 waves of different frequencies combine.
Yeah, it's actually the same slide. It's just
Oh yeah.
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 And that's true. I didn't discuss timbre. It was outside the scope of this because it's very specific. But timbre, of course. So because there's a lot of different ways you can modify that sound wave, and so you know one of the ways is reflection, like you see here, and another way is transduction, which is the actual physical motion through an instrument. And both of those will change the frequency and amplitude of a sound wave. And then what you'll hear will be that complex waveform. And so usually timbre is a combination of the whatever how the sound wave is transduced through the instrument as well as how it interacts with the environment.
Okay, another question. I know you recently released your song.
Yes.
What was it? Look at, yeah. So what was the process that you went to mixing that song?
Yeah, great. So
Recording?
it's perfect because I brought it up as the example. So I have 2 examples.
Awesome album cover.
Yes, thank you. So but I think as I will answer your question as soon as I get to it. So if there's any other questions beforehand, because that's going to be like I can talk forever about that. So I don't want to cut anybody off before we completely pivot to you know some of like you know how we actually go about it, because I've been talking about theory, which is you know important, but of course utilizing it takes another set of skills. So any other questions before I show you just some quick examples? Awesome. So let me let me stop sharing this, or actually, you know what? I'm trying to so actually it's you can hear my system audio, I'm pretty sure. So let me know if you can hear this. Can you hear that when I play it?
I don't know. I don't hear anything right now.
So what I was going to show, here, I'm going to stop sharing this. I think I have to share, so I think, oh, here it is. When I go to share a screen, I'm going to choose share my computer sound. So now you should be able to hear it. So let me just go to like here. Can you hear this when I play it back?
Yeah.
So
why would we listen to this?
so it's for two reasons. So the first is I want you guys to see. So I have two audio signals. Really, and something that is unique is so this utilized the ORTF recording for basically microphone recording technique. So when we record our microphones, microphones pick up a mono signal, and so essentially what we would hear normally, essentially what the microphone actually plays back is something like this. And using the properties of the microphones, essentially what their set distance and the directions that they're pointing in, so that you get that phase cancellation and you have your amplitude differences, we can get a sense of stereo space. So, and the reason I chose this example is because in this example, the violin is very, very hard panned left. And so the basses and cellos are very, very hard panned right. But you get the illusion of entire stereo field where you have something like violas in front of you, even though it's not what you actually hear in reality. And so when I translate this from a mono sound, which is how it was recorded, and when I do the panning, you guys should have a sense of space now, versus when we're hearing in mono, everything sounds like it's straight in front of you. And the reason for that is because if you look at the way this audio signal is playing back, it's pulling back the exact same audio through both channels, versus when I, do the panning, of course, you can see that the left channel is significantly louder at that portion of time. And so another reason I want to show this example, I could have showed the same example from the same recording session, is that if you know how to utilize the techniques, you don't need a million microphones. So I know some people here on the intermission orchestra, you notice that at their concert they had like 18 microphones. So versus I only had 2 microphones. So even though I only have 2 microphones, you can hear the full stereo spectrum as if you're there. And so that's just all about figuring out how to actually utilize these techniques in practice. And one thing I also really, really like about this, and which is something I'm going to show compared to the other recording, is that with orchestral recording in general, but especially this one from that session, can you guys all see this frequency spectrum? Is I can actually point out with basically pinpoint accuracy, I can tell you exactly which instruments are playing at which time. And so I'll tell you that this here is the bass, this is the cello, these are violas and second violins, first violins, and these peak harmonics. Actually, this one right here is from the solo. And so one thing I really like about orchestral recording is that the frequency spectrum is very clean, and the frequencies are very, very well defined. And you notice up here at the high frequencies, of course, the lower frequencies, there isn't as much noise, which is really nice. That's part of it's the microphones. Another of it is just the properties of the room. and the third is like the instruments themselves. So yeah, but of course, with this, I'm not doing anything else other than like the panning in terms of like the mix. But I do there was some of course different effects, signal processing, and it wasn't to do anything other than maximize the playback compatibility. All of these other effects, mainly removing any bass frequencies that are non-existent in the audio recording, and making sure that the audio signal never crosses that 0 decibel threshold. So yeah, that is the end of that example. And the reason I showed that one first is because when you get to something like that music project that I just released, you know, it's just massive. So here we're in the digital audio workstation, and we have so the digital audio workstation I use is Reason. So there's many workstations. There's Record, there is Ableton, Pro Tools. You know, I have a real preference for Reason because it simulates all of the analog recording tools. So everything you see on here is like what you'd see on a mixing board in a recording studio. And so it has digitally basically reconstructed the entire recording studio. So that's why I really like it. So you have all those tools I was talking about before. Faders, our panning tools, our master fader. Here's our EQ units, our compressors, gates, gain units, so everything. But there's a lot. So we have just all these audio tracks, many of them. And so, you know, I guess you Gabby asked the question earlier, which was, you know, what was my process? And that is something that's really hard to distill. It's different for every person, and it's also different for me for everything that I create. With this, I really started with one musical idea, which was this basically this right here. So let me see if I can just solo that. So. And that's it. And that's like enough for me to like execute a whole song. Is like if you have just an idea theme that's strong enough. And so what I did is I take that, and then you know, let's start expanding upon it. So I'm going to show you you know, how we're building up different layers. So you know, that's just a kind of like a little main theme. So let's see what else is playing here at this time. So we have bass guitar, electric guitar. So let's. Let me find these other ones. Notice I can make you hear it in your right ear, and I can make you hear this one in like your left ear. And so, but when I have two of them playing simultaneously, you have a whole like bigger stereo sound field. You know, I keep increasing the textures. Let's see what else do I have here. Some bass, some drums, something like that. Let me find where they are. So some bass, some drums, and so now we're starting to get to something that's a lot bigger. But the more instruments we add, you run into this risk of all of them starting to coincide with each other on this frequency spectrum. And you know, that's bad. Potentially, you know, you get things like frequency masking. Whereas if you have two instruments that play the same frequency, but one's louder than the other, one will cover up the other one entirely. So it's almost as if it doesn't exist. And so really, you have to make room. So sometimes, you know, we love to add, but a lot of times we have to subtract information in order to make things more clear. You know, just like with writing, you want to be concise to get the information across, and sometimes you need to remove information to actually make it more visible. And so I'll show you how I used EQ to do that. So I used EQ in that case to reduce the bass frequencies. So if you look at something like the vocals, for instance. So I'm not going to play them right now, but I have this shape where basically I cut off all low frequencies, and that was to make room for, say, like the kick of a bass drum, or like a bass, electric bass or bass. So yeah, one of the biggest challenges, of course, with this track was, you know, there's just a lot of bass trying to fight each other for that same space. So that's okay. So that's like, you know, I got a musical idea, right? And so, but of course, you know, that's not enough for something like a song. And so you really have to organize it into some sort of structure. And so I don't have it on this computer, but I could show you, like, you know, for instance, on like my first EP, I had songs that followed just like purely, you know, verse chorus verse chorus verse chorus. You know, that's a way of organizing music into phrases, and then it's all the same. You know, those musical phrases, when you have them determined, you just put them into this audio workstation, right? And in this case, you know, you can clearly see. Let me just play the whole song with everything, all the layers, and there we go. So here's where we get to a verse, and you notice when the verse comes in, we have these textures, right? And then the chorus in this is just a single line, so it's not substantial at all. But I'll transition, you know, in the chorus of this to a different musical phrase, and change some of the instrument textures. And here, like, I actually create empty space. But then it comes back. Then it comes back to the verse. So this one, at first, you know, you have your typical verse chorus format. But then basically what I did is, instead of, because you know, I like to change things up, is instead of, you know, repeating it for endlessly, like most pop songs do, is I completely shift it in the second half. And like, so where I have chorus, and then it ends and it just becomes instruments. And so, you know, there's a lot of work in terms of thinking about transitions and how you transition between these phrases. And you know, that's what these all are. Transition. And before you get to a totally new musical style. Yeah. And you can kind of see, you know, there's a lot going on. You know, here I increased the level. I changed the panning. So if we go back to the mixer, you'll see at this point in time, look at these guitar solos. They're moving from left to right. And same with this thing right here. just moving all over the place. And look at their volumes, their dynamics are going up and down. So that's all automated. So, you know, something that's really powerful is that all of this was done right in digitally. And so you know, you hear like this guitar solo going on right now. But that's not what the original guitar audio signal sounded like. You know, so I had two guitar solos. Actually, it's not one, it's actually two guitar solos. So what it sounded like at first was something like this. So we have the two guitar tracks, which is absolutely not anything what you hear. And then so let's start adding. And so what we ended up with is nothing like what we started with. And so yeah, so you know, if you compare this to of course, let me see, I had another document on here. I'll just bring it up to contrast this. This one that I released back in September is more along like something like along a pop song, not perfectly, but you can see because it's more along that structure. It's a lot more periodic. Verse chorus a lot, so it's a lot different. But the key with this one is how you, one thing is, you know, okay, so like with things that are repeating, how do you maintain interest? And so of course it's all about changing from phrase to phrase the instrumentation, and changing like, you know, all the effects and everything. So we could listen to say this is the first verse of the song. We have a bass, two audio tracks, 6 guitars, and drums. But then when we transition to the verse the second time, so this guitar that was playing left and right channels has changed. In addition, there's vocals have changed, and there's 2 additional synthesizers that didn't exist before. And so, you know, that's, you know, these are all just things about how do you maintain interest, you know, after you know, after like someone actually starts listening to it. So yeah, does anyone have any questions on these topics? So unfortunately, I don't have the recording on this computer that I would like to show you, but like some extreme cases of where I've like done stereo panning. I think this one might be the closest one, because one of the coolest things about the stereo effect is the effect of motion through space. So if you listen to this, so it's not as perfect as another audio track that I had, but essentially you should feel a little bit of left to right motion with that. I really wish I had my other example up and ready. because it's an extreme example of motion through space. So, but you know, I could even do it simply, just with panning, you know. Say I were to look at this. Oh, I lied. Let's not look at that. Something, yeah, like this. This one. So you can hear a lot of that stereo motion. Where it's like circling around you. So, but there's tools to make it not just left and right, but actually to calculate, you know, like, because I think you guys have all experienced things like like Doppler shifts. Like, you know, when a fire truck passes by you, it sounds higher pitched than when it's leaving from you. And so there are ways of actually simulating the Doppler shift, which is, you know, what I would like to show you, but I don't have it right at this time. But yeah, I think that concludes. You know, I can't teach you, you know how all this stuff works, but I hope that at least now you guys are at least interested in finding out some more on your own. So there's a lot of free tools to get started with, you know, audio production. You know, even Reason has their own free version that you can look up. But you know, to be honest, the most powerful audio tool I think in existence is actually GarageBand, which is on, you know, pretty much anyone's iPhone, iPad, iMac, and actually something about like 60% of like all pop songs, or 70% of all pop songs that you hear on the radio today, at some form or another, were produced either entirely to the completion, or you know, at least like the initial ideas were executed in GarageBand. So there's, you know, so many tools, but is there anything? Unfortunately, these don't have it. No. Yes. So that's I think that's it for my talk for today. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you. Isaac, I have a quick question
Yes.
about panning. Do you need any sort of special recordings, or do you need to record with a certain number of microphones to create that effect, or are you able to create a sort of 3D surround sound effect just by using like a one microphone mono recording?
So you can. So there are tricks to do that. So of course, the best way to get an illusion of space is to use a minimum of 2 microphones in one of those configurations that I was showing: X, Y, or TF, mid-side. There's bloom line pairs. So having 2 microphones is the best way of getting that, like, immediately some spatial information. But say you were to have only 1 microphone. Oh, I don't know why my game clip ended. So, oh, I guess I need to share my screen again. And I actually do that in this. Actually, I do it in Monolith System, and it's kind of cheating. So what I did is actually this guitar introduction. So so if this is just a single mono signal. So let's take a look. Let's figure out. Here it is. So if that's the signal. And something that you can do is what I did is see, I recorded this twice. So 3, 4, 5. So those are actually like I think I played the chord like 5 times. But then what I did is you see I chopped it up, and I took the second chord that I played and put it here. And what that does is, if you look at the waveforms, they're just slightly different. Yeah, you got to really zoom in. Like these peaks are just very, very slightly different. But because they are different, when I play them together, it sounds like a stereo recording. It sounds like you recorded like with 2 microphones, even though it's just a single input. So versus so this wouldn't work if you just took, say, 1 recording and doubled it and put the panning left and right. That doesn't work. What happens is if you have a mono signal, you duplicate it, you put it left and right, you still have the same mono signal. So the signals have to be different. In this case, there is a little bit of the time phase shift. And that time phase shift is what allows us to have the impression of stereo when you play it back. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. And that's actually a really cool effect. So if what's important is the time phase shift, would you be able to take a 1 microphone recording and
Yes.
then just, is that what the panning does? It just shifts it?
Yeah, so no,
slightly.
I'll just do that right now.
Cool.
So what I'll do is I'll duplicate this and I'll mute this. So right, these are the exact same. This is the copy. So listen to playback. So it's panned hard left and right, but it sounds like it's coming from straight in front of you, doesn't it? I'll play it one more time. So it's like coming straight in front of you. This is what it sounds like if you just duplicate that audio track. However, what I can do is say I'm going to move it by 1/128th of a beat or something like that, some ridiculously small number. Let's see if that was small enough. And then let's see what it sounds like. Yeah, do you hear it? So all I did is I just shifted it in time. So here's what it sounds like, 2 duplicated signals. Oh wait, sorry. I'll duplicate this one. Mute this one. So duplicated signals. There's no stereo effect whatsoever. It's coming from right in front of you. I shifted this signal by, a fraction of a second, and you get, so it's like magic.
Thanks, that's really cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is just my headphones or maybe it's because Zoom can't really transmit the audio in its full quality. But I do hear like a slight difference.
Yeah, I could definitely find a more dramatic example too. And so like probably if we look at this one, look at me, Sorrow. Let's take a look. So you notice I have these 2. I have like these 2 guitars that are playing left and right. Oh, sorry. this might be a better example. So, oh, actually, I lied. That's a bad example. That's a bad example. So let's turn the stereo width down to 0 for both of these. No. Yeah, I have other clips. I will try one more thing. I have one more idea. To try to show like a more dramatic version of this example. Let's see. Yes, this is going to be good. Or if this one. So this one you should be able to hear in stereo. So versus, so if I duplicate this, so this will sound mono, like it's coming from straight in front of you, even though it's 2 audio tracks. Just this very slight differences. I'll play it one more time. So here's what it sounds like when you duplicate the audio track with no phase shift. It's coming straight in front of you. Now you should hear it in both ears. Is that one a little bit more clear?
Yeah, that was a much clearer example. Thanks. That was really cool.
Yeah, and that's just due to very, very subtle phase shifts. And, you know, you look at it from this macro scale, they look exactly the same, but just those very, 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 very small time differences between them enable us to create a really crazy stereo effect. Yeah, there's a lot, a lot I didn't cover, but it's a lot of fun. It's I think to be a good audio engineer, of course, you need to have a theoretical understanding of what you're working with. Because the best way to have control, right? Imagine if you learn how to write, but you only knew 18 letters of the alphabet. You're missing 8 letters of the alphabet. You're not going to be able to. You're restricted, infinitely restricted by what you can create by all those missing letters. And so the fundamental understanding are also the fundamental tools to all this audio signal processing. And manipulating audio, understanding data. It's very science. It's not a prerequisite, but it's just about understanding how things work and how the world works and why that is, and that's why I find it interesting.